Hi, I wanted to do a very brief video again on following up on Jordan Peterson's question and answers about church. I did a video yesterday, and YouTube gave me kind of an angry looking face, even though I didn't have an angry face in the video. But one of the things I think about church all the time. Obviously, I'm a pastor. Well, one of the things that I realize about church is that in many ways it's an acquired taste. I was raised in church, so I sat in the pew, and as I mentioned in the last video, church was the Sunday afternoon was probably the time I got more spankings than any other time as a kid. I didn't get a lot of spankings as a kid, but I had a terrible time sitting in church, and I'd always sit next to my mother, and she would put me at the very back of the church by the back door. So if I couldn't sit still, she'd whisk me out back, and it was far more a threat than follow through. But she had my sisters isolated, and yeah, church is just a hard thing. And if you've ever seen the Mr. Bean videos of him going to church, it's just hysterical. And I think the reason it's funny, if you grew up in that context, is that you can relate to it. That people often sleep in church, and I see them sleep because I'm the pastor, but I don't take offense. When I was a college kid, I slept through church all the time. It didn't mean I didn't get anything out of it or didn't appreciate it. As a college kid, nobody was forcing me to go to church, but I went, and I'd be interested to listen to the sermon, and then I'd fall asleep in the middle of it. One of the things that I really enjoy about church, one of the treatments of church that always sticks in my mind is C.S. Lewis and the Screwtape Letters. And if you've never read the Screwtape Letters, it was kind of C.S. Lewis's breakout book. When he wrote the Screwtape Letters, it really caught the imagination of England. And I forget what year it came out, but it was fairly early in his career of writing Christian things. And the premise of the book is that this is a senior devil teaching a younger devil how to snare a person. Now, in chapter 2 of the Screwtape Letters, it goes like this: Dear Wormwood, I note with grave displeasure that your patient has become a Christian. Do not indulge the hope that you will escape the usual penalties. Instead, in your best moments, I trust you would hardly even wish to do so. In the meantime, we must make the best of the situation. There is no need to despair. Hundreds of these adult converts have been reclaimed after a brief sojourn in the enemy's camp, and are now with us. All the habits of the patient, both mental and bodily, are still in our favor. In other words, C.S. Lewis is saying that there is in some ways nothing natural about enjoying church, even after the seeker movement went through North America in the 80s and 90s, trying to make the church a safe place to hear a dangerous message. Church is still hard, because church is full of people, and people are chimps filled with snakes. And this is my favorite line of the chapter. One of our great allies at present is the church. One of our great allies at present is the church itself. Do not misunderstand me. I do not mean the church as we see her spread out through all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners. I think about that line often from Lewis, because when I see the church and all its comedy and its tragedy and its silliness and its banality sometimes, I often think of this line with Lewis, that from the perspective of eternity, the church is terrible with army and terrible as an army with banners. That, I confess, is a spectacle which makes our boldest tempters uneasy, but fortunately is quite invisible to these humans. All your patient sees is the half-finished sham Gothic erection on the new building estate. When he goes inside, he sees the local grocer, with a rather oily expression on his face, bustling up to offer him one shiny little book containing a liturgy which neither of them understands, and one shabby little book containing corrupt texts of a number of religious lyrics, mostly bad, and in very small print. In fact, if you read more about Lewis despised a lot of the music he heard in church, and so what Lewis is reflecting here are his attitudes. When he gets to his pew and looks around, he sees just the selection of his neighbors whom he has hitherto avoided. And again, you go to church, you find people you don't want to be with. You want to lean pretty heavily on those neighbors. Make his mind flit to and fro between an expression of the body of Christ and the actual faces in the next pew. It matters very little, of course, what kind of people that next pew really contains. You may know one of them to be a great warrior in the enemy's side. No matter, your patient, thanks to our Father below, is a fool. Provided that any of these neighbors sing out of tune, or have boots that squeak, or double chins, or odd clothes, the patient will quite easily believe that their religion must therefore be something ridiculous. At his present stage, you see, he has an idea of Christians in his mind, which he supposes to be spiritual, but which, in fact, is largely pictorial. His mind is full of togas and sandals and armor and bare legs, and the mere fact that other people in church wear modern clothes is a real, though of course an unconscious, difficulty for him. Never let it come to the surface. Never let him ask what he expects them to look like. Keep everything hazy in his mind now, and you will have all eternity wherein to amuse yourself by producing in him the peculiar kind of clarity which hell affords. Work hard then on the disappointment or anticlimax, which is certainly among the patients during his first weeks as a churchman. The enemy allows this disappointment to occur on the threshold of every human endeavor. It occurs when the boy who has been enchanted in the nursery by stories from the Odyssey buckles down to really learning Greek. And again, this is exactly the point. We don't go to church because, I feel like going. We go to church because we need to. We go to church because we need to be embedded in the body of Christ and embedded in the story and embedded in the fandom. So again, the little boy who loved listening to the stories of the Odyssey now has to learn Greek. It occurs when lovers have gotten married and begin the real task of learning to live together. In every department of life, it marks the transition from dreaming inspiration to laborious doing. Even the enemy takes great risks because he has a curious fantasy of making all these disgusting little human vermin into what he calls his free lovers, and servants, sons, is the word he uses, with his inveterate love of denigrating the whole spiritual world by unnatural liaisons with the two-legged animals. Desiring their freedom, he therefore refuses to carry them, by their mere affections and habits, to any of the goals which he sets before them. He leaves them to do it on their own, and there lies our opportunity. But also remember, there lies our danger. If once they get through this initial dryness successfully, then they become much less dependent on emotion and therefore much harder to tempt. I've been writing hitherto on the assumption that the people in the next pew afford no rational ground for disappointment. Of course, if they do, if the patient knows that the woman with the absurd hat is a fanatical bridge player, or the man with squeaky boots a miser and an extortioner, then your task is so much easier. All you then have to prove is that their religion is mere hypocrisy and convention. I skipped a line. All you then have to do is to keep out of his mind the question, if I, being what I am, can consider that I am in some sense a Christian, why should the different vices of these people in the next pew prove that their religion is mere hypocrisy and convention? In other words, once you get to the point of realizing, I am a hypocrite, I am the problem with the world, I am the worst Christian you could imagine. Then when you go to church and you realize they're all a bunch of lousy Christians, well, suddenly we're taking the next steps to something truly helpful. You might ask whether it is possible to keep such an obvious thought from occurring even to a human mind. It is, Wormwood, it is. Handle him properly, and it simply won't come to his mind. He has not been anything like enough with the enemy to have any real humility yet. Again, What does it take to go to church? What does it take to sit in that service and hear some dim pastor ramble on about a point that probably nobody cares about? What does it take to go sit in a room where the worship leader picks music that you hate and someone goes on and on about their problems like the only person in the world? It takes humility. Well, what do you practice in church? Humility. I remember when I was learning to preach, and I was, a seminary student full of myself, imagining that I had all these things to offer and great gifts. And I remember being in church, and there was a pinch hitting preacher, and I thought that person did a horrible job. And I remember listening to one of the great saints in that church say something positive about his sermon. And I thought, did you hear that same sermon? That was a mess. And then it struck me. Where's the problem? Was the sermon a mess? Yeah, probably. But where was the bigger problem? It was in me. It was in my heart. I had no humility. C.S. Lewis goes on to say, humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking of yourself less. Back to Wormwood. It is, Wormwood, it is. Handle him properly and it won't come into his head. He has not been anything long enough with the enemy to have any real humility yet. What he says, even on his knees, about his own sinfulness is all parrot talk. At bottom, he still believes he runs up a very favorable credit balance in the enemy's ledger by allowing himself to be converted, and thinks that he is showing great humility and condescension in going to church with these smug, commonplace neighbors at all. Keep him in that state of mind as long as you can. So, again, if you listen to my advice video, you know what I said. If you want to explore Christianity, if you want to do it from the inside, then there's no better thing you can do than go to church. And when you go to church, you will be tested because the sermons will be dull, you will fall asleep, the neighbors will be annoying, there'll be all kinds of things to drive you crazy in church. Well, what is that a pure opportunity for? Well, to grow in humility, to grow in love, to learn to love your neighbor as yourself, and even to learn to love your enemies. So there's a word about church.